There are images that send chills down your spine, not from horror, but from the sheer impossibility of what they depict. Picture a black and white photograph from the early 20th century. Endless churning ocean, waves crashing against concrete pillars, horizon empty of any land, and in the middle of this watery wasteland, like a ghost, a massive steam locomotive thunders along, belching black smoke into the sky. This isn't a scene from a science fiction movie. This isn't CGI or Photoshop manipulation. This is the Florida Overseas Railroad, also known as Flagler's Folly. And what mainstream history tells us about this structure might be the most audacious lie ever sold to the American public. The official narrative feeds us a heartwarming tale of human triumph over nature, of engineering genius conquering the elements, of visionary millionaire Henry Flagler, who decided to connect Miami to Key West with steel rails running directly over open ocean. But the moment you apply critical thinking and toss aside the textbook fairy tales, this perfect picture crumbles to dust. We're told that in 1905, when most of Florida was impassable swampland, crawling with alligators and malaria-carrying mosquitoes, a group of enthusiasts just went ahead and built 150 miles of railroad, with a significant portion running directly over open sea. Let those numbers sink in. We're not talking about a bridge across some river. We're talking about a full-scale railroad line where ocean depth reaches dozens of feet and the seafloor consists of shifting sand and coral. How did they do it? With what equipment? Shovels and steam hammers? Let's face the facts and tear this fairy tale apart piece by piece. Official chronology claims construction lasted from 1905 to 1912. 7 years, just 7 years to erect what contemporaries without exaggeration called the eighth wonder of the world. In conditions where even today, with satellite navigation and nuclear power at our disposal, such a project would take decades and cost trillions of dollars. We're asked to believe that workers, mostly drifters and Caribbean immigrants, hand-mixed concrete in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Have you ever tried pouring a concrete slab in your own garage? Now imagine doing that in the middle of the sea, standing waist-deep in the salt water under scorching tropical sun while hurricanes barrel past. Historians proudly report that construction required millions of barrels of cement. Millions. Where did it all come from? In the early 20th century, logistics capabilities were primitive at best. Florida was civilization's dead end. The railroad that could have delivered materials to the coast barely existed. They were still building it. A classic chicken and egg problem. To build the road, you need to deliver materials. But to deliver materials, you need the road. We're told cement was shipped from Germany and northern states. Can you imagine the fleet required to transport such volumes? Where are the port documents? Where are photos of thousands of ships unloading directly at sea? They don't exist. All we have is a handful of staged shots where people in clean shirts pose against already completed structures. The most intriguing part begins when you examine the structures themselves. These gigantic concrete arches, bridges, and viaducts look like they've stood there for centuries. Look at the famous 7-Mile Bridge. These aren't primitive beams thrown across pilings. These are elegant, powerful arch constructions resembling Roman aqueducts. The technology for building such arches requires sophisticated formwork and crucially, solid foundation. How did they lay foundation on the ocean floor in 1908? The official version mumbles something about caissons in wooden boxes. Caisson work at depths where water pressure can crush a human, without scuba gear, without deep-sea equipment. We're told divers descended to the bottom in primitive helmets and leveled the seafloor with shovels. Do you seriously believe that thousands of miles of underwater foundation were leveled by hand by people receiving air through rubber hoses? This sounds less like an engineering report and more like a myth about Hercules. There's another aspect the tour guides prefer to skip. Cost. Henry Flagler, oil tycoon, Rockefeller's partner, supposedly spent $50 million of his own money on this venture. Adjusted for inflation, that's billions today. For what? What was the goal? Key West at the time was a backwater island with a population of maybe 20,000. There was zero economic benefit from connecting it to the mainland. Shipping pineapples and cigars? Seriously? You're going to build the most complex engineering project in human history, risk thousands of lives, spend a fortune, no, to transport pineapples? That's absurd. Capitalists of that era knew how to count money better than we do. If Flagler invested in this project, he knew something we don't. Or, far more likely, he didn't build anything from scratch. Study old maps. Navigation charts from the 15th and 16th centuries often depict the Florida Keys chain as continuous land or as structures connected by bridges. What if Flagler didn't build the railroad but excavated it? What if these concrete monsters descending into the water are remnants of an ancient, far more advanced civilization that was washed away by a previous cataclysm? That would explain why the timeline was so compressed. 7 years is unrealistic for construction, but perfectly reasonable for restoration. It also explains the absence of photographs showing actual underwater foundation pouring. They simply don't exist because the foundation stood there long before Flagler was born. Workers merely laid rails on existing megalithic structures that had been cleared of silt and sand. We're not witnessing a triumph of early 20th century engineering. We're witnessing brazen appropriation, theft of someone else's heritage. They passed off ruins of a great era as new construction so we wouldn't ask inconvenient questions about who lived here before us. And that train rolling across water isn't a symbol of progress. It's a symbol of our blindness. We gaze at a miracle and believe people with pickaxes created it, though our eyes scream otherwise. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Dig deeper into technical documentation and facts emerge that make your hair stand on end. Let's set emotions aside and turn to merciless chemistry and physics. The main character in this story is concrete. Official sources proudly state that construction of the overseas railroad used special cement imported from Germany because American equivalents supposedly couldn't withstand aggressive marine environments. But any builder will tell you cement is just the binding agent. Making concrete requires sand, gravel, and, most critically, water. Enormous quantities of fresh water. Using seawater to mix concrete is absolutely forbidden. Salts destroy rebar and the concrete structure itself within years, turning monolith into crumbs. Now engage your logic. We're in open ocean. The nearest freshwater sources on the mainland are hundreds of miles away. The Florida Keys have virtually no fresh water. Locals barely had enough rainwater for themselves. We're asked to believe in a logistical miracle worthy of divine intervention. Historians claim water was delivered by steamship in tanks. Can you comprehend the volume? Pouring hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of concrete requires millions of gallons of water. That's a continuous conveyor of tankers shuttling day and night for 7 years. But where are these tankers in port registries? Where are fuel expenses for the water hauling fleet? These figures are absent from the Flagler Company's accounting records. Either they used ocean water directly, which would doom the structure to collapse within a decade, or the concrete was already there. Notice the quality of these pillars. Over 100 years have passed. They've survived dozens of Category 5 hurricanes. Modern concrete in marine environments starts crumbling after 50 years, requiring major repairs. But Flagler's pillars stand like rocks. This suggests we're not looking at early 20th century Portland cement, but that legendary Roman concrete or geopolymer, whose secret is officially considered lost. Technology that makes stone grow stronger from contact with seawater. If Flagler simply found these pillars, he didn't need to haul water. He just needed to lay rails on top. Now let's discuss the foundation. The Florida Keys archipelago consists of coral islands. Coral limestone is porous like a sponge. The official version claims workers built cofferdams, watertight enclosures, pumped out the water, and poured foundation. But any hydraulic engineer would laugh in your face. Pumping water from an enclosure sitting on a porous sponge in the middle of the ocean is impossible. Water seeps up through the ground itself faster than any steam pumps of that era could remove it. Water pressure at 30 feet depth is enormous. To pour concrete dry, you'd need to seal the ocean floor for acres around. Such technology didn't exist in 1905. So either they poured concrete directly into water, which would cause it to wash away and lose all strength, or again, the foundations were already there, deeply rooted in bedrock by unknown technology capable of manipulating matter at the molecular level. Look at construction photographs again. What do you see? Enormous cyclopean pillars and tiny wooden cranes that look like matchboxes. The ratio between equipment scale and results creates cognitive dissonance. Those cranes could lift a wooden house beam, but not multi-ton concrete blocks or industrial-scale mortar containers. In many shots, workers simply mill around already completed structures. The impression is of ants crawling over a dinosaur skeleton. They're building wooden scaffolding, laying planks, painting something, but the actual process of erecting giant pylons from nothing is practically never documented. The dynamic picture shows before photo, empty sea, after photo, finished pillar. The intermediate stage is a black box. What about the workforce? We're told about 4,000 workers. Where did they live? In floating dormitories? In tropical heat? Without antibiotics? Without proper sanitation? Crammed onto barges in the middle of the ocean? Epidemics of cholera, dysentery, and malaria should have killed them by hundreds weekly. Mortality on the Panama Canal, built during the same period in similar climate, was horrific despite government backing. And here we have a private operation. Official death statistics for Flagler's construction site are suspiciously low. But even assuming 4,000 supermen worked without rest, the math still doesn't add up. The work volume for building 150 miles of bridges and embankments in open sea requires tens of thousands of workers and modern mechanization. Either there were 10 times more workers and their bones rest in these bridges' foundations, or work volume was much smaller because most of the road already existed. There's another fact guidebooks prefer to omit: hurricanes. In 1906, at the very start of construction, a massive hurricane struck Florida. It scattered workers' floating camps. Hundreds died. Equipment was destroyed. Logically, such a blow should have halted construction for years or killed the project entirely. Investors should have fled. But Flagler, as if possessed, continues work at double speed, as though the hurricane didn't destroy the construction site, but actually helped clear something away. Perhaps the storm washed away centuries of silt and sand deposits, exposing an ancient road, making workers' jobs easier. This explains their fanatical persistence. They saw that beneath the water lay a ready-made highway and understood the prize was worth the risk. Finally, the train itself. Look at the technical specifications of steam locomotives from that era. Heavy, unwieldy machines, the vibration created by a loaded train crossing a bridge is colossal. Concrete pillars must absorb this vibration. If calculations are off by even a millimeter, resonance will destroy the bridge. Who in the early 20th century could calculate resonance oscillations for a 7-mile bridge standing on unstable seabed? That's computer modeling level complexity. Yet the bridges stood, trains ran, until something happened that made the elite shut down this project and attempt to erase its true purpose from memory. We're approaching the most chilling episode, the catastrophe that exposed the structure's true nature and explains why the railroad was so hastily paved over and converted into a highway. In 1935, the Overseas Railroad's story takes a sharp, bloody, and completely illogical turn that finally rips the mask off the official version. Labor Day, September 2nd. The most powerful hurricane in recorded U.S. history hits the Florida Keys. Barometric pressure drops to unthinkable levels. Wind tears skin from faces. A 20-foot storm surge engulfs the islands. And into this hellscape, they send a rescue train. 10 cars packed with World War I veterans who were, pay attention, building an automobile road there. Why were veterans constructing a road parallel to an operating railroad? Official history stammers about Depression-era social programs. But think about it. This looks like a large-scale cleanup operation. Thousands of men who'd been through war, who knew how to handle equipment and explosives, digging on remote islands. Perhaps they uncovered something they weren't supposed to see, something lying beneath the cultural layer that Flagler couldn't or didn't have time to exploit. The hurricane destroyed the train. The photograph of the train lying on its side amid raging elements became an icon of the disaster. But look carefully not at the train, but at what it was lying on. The train was swept away. The embankments Flagler's workers built were swept away. Wooden structures were smashed to splinters. But the concrete bridges, those delicate-looking arches standing in open ocean, didn't even budge. A Category 5 hurricane capable of erasing cities from the map couldn't inflict significant damage on the main structures of Flagler's Folly. This is physical nonsense if you believe they were built from ordinary concrete at the turn of the century. Modern bridges after such loads require immediate demolition due to hidden cracks and material fatigue. Yet these still stand. This proves something terrifying for historians. Only the parts that 20th century people built were destroyed. Rails, déciments, it's the superstructure. But the foundation, the ancient megalithic base, ignored nature's assault with the arrogance of eternity. Then something strange happens. Instead of repairing the tracks, since the bridges are intact, the foundation is intact, you just need to relay the rails. The company declares bankruptcy and sells the entire complex to the state of Florida. Guess how much? $640,000. You read that right. A project that supposedly cost $50 million in gold, billions today, sold for scrap metal prices. Less than 1% of cost. No capitalist in their right mind would accept such a deal if they'd actually built it with their own hands and blood. This is the behavior of a scavenger who found something valuable, used it, broke it, and dumped it for pennies because it cost them nothing to acquire. This is economic proof that Flagler didn't build, but merely exploited what he found. Once exploitation became impossible due to destruction of the primitive rail overlay, they disposed of the object. What do state authorities do? They don't restore the railroad. They decide to convert it into an automobile highway, the famous Overseas Highway. And here the geometry circus begins. Railroad bridges are narrow. For a train, one track suffices. For a two-lane highway, you need much more space. We're told that 30s engineers simply laid wider concrete slabs on top, converting railroad bridges into automobile ones. Picture the load. You take a bridge designed for vertical train loads and start widening it sideways, creating enormous lever pressure on the edges without reinforcing the foundation, without expanding the pillars. Any structural engineer will tell you the construction should collapse like a house of cards. Center of gravity shifts, lateral loads increase, but the bridges stand. This is only possible if the original pillars were designed for much greater width and load than the narrow-gauge railroad of the early century. Perhaps Flagler used only the central portion of a giant ancient roadway, and in the 30s, highway builders simply uncovered or completed the side sections that were always meant to be there. Moreover, converting railroad to highway is the perfect way to destroy evidence. Rails can be studied, stamps, steel composition, unusual gauge width, but under a layer of asphalt, history dies forever. Paving over is history revisers' favorite trick. How much cobblestone, star fortresses, and ancient foundations now rest beneath highways worldwide? The Overseas Highway is a sarcophagus. We drive on the lid of a coffin, hiding technologies that could change our world. Think about it. Why Florida? Why this particular appendix of the USA? The Bermuda Triangle is right next door. Strange magnetic anomalies, and this road leading to nowhere, into the sea. Maybe these arches were never bridges at all. Look at their form. They repeat with monotonous machine precision. Hundreds of identical arches. This resembles not so much a bridge as a waveguide or part of a giant energy circuit. If we assume the ocean was once lower or wasn't here at all, this structure could have been an aqueduct, a magnetic levitation transit line, or something we don't even have words for. Flagler tried to adapt this ancient high-tech for his primitive steam engines. But nature, or the structure's own defense mechanisms, rejected the foreign body. A steam locomotive on these tracks looked like a horse-drawn cart on a spaceport runway. absurd, dangerous, and temporary. There's another demographic issue. Where did all these workers go after the construction of the Century and after the highway conversion? Thousands of people should have stayed in Florida, telling children and grandchildren how they mix concrete in the ocean. But Florida Keys folklore is empty. No family legends, no diaries from ordinary workers describing technical details of underwater pouring. Just dry official statistics and newspaper clippings, as if extras were brought in, staged photos were taken, and then everyone dissolved into thin air. Or there were far fewer workers because their task was limited to clearing and cosmetic repairs. We see results of millions of man-hours of work, but no trace of these millions of people in the region's genetics or memory. This is a classic sign of falsification. The object exists, but who built it and how it remains fog? Let's step back from concrete and talk money and people. Math is the only language that cannot lie. And math turns the official Flagler Railroad story into cheap farce. Look at early 20th century demographic data. Key West population was around 20,000, a small isolated town living on fishing, sponge harvesting, and cigar manufacturing. And for this tiny settlement producing nothing strategically important, they launch an infrastructure project comparable in complexity to the moon landing. Imagine if today the government decided to build a trillion-dollar Hyperloop branch to a village of 500 people. That's economic suicide. No bank, no investor, even one as eccentric as Flagler, would give a cent for this. Capitalism doesn't work that way. Payback period for such a project hauling cigars and pineapples would be thousands of years. This screaming contradiction can only mean one thing. The construction's purpose was entirely different. Either Key West wasn't just a fishing village, but an important node, an entrance to some giant system hidden from our eyes, possibly underground or underwater, or the road wasn't intended to connect to this island as we know it at all. We look at a map and see an island chain. But what if we look at the seafloor relief? Geologists know global ocean levels haven't always been the same. Remove the water, and the Florida Keys become peaks of a mountain ridge or edges of a giant plateau. These bridges could have been built when this was dry land or water levels were significantly lower. They didn't connect islands, they spanned canyons. This explains the height and power of the pillars. Flagler didn't build a bridge across the sea. He simply adapted the upper portion of an ancient viaduct that once crossed dry land before water swallowed this territory. We're a civilization living in the attic of a flooded skyscraper, naively believing we built this house just because we painted the walls. Look at the global context. Similar arched structures descending into water or standing in impossible places are scattered worldwide. Scotland, India, China, Russia. Everywhere we see the same architectural signature. This so-called antique style that historians sheepishly attribute to Romans, local feudal lords, or 19th century colonizers. But the signature is identical. Standardized blocks, polygonal masonry, arched vaults, incredible seismic resistance. This speaks to the existence of a unified global civilization that ruled the planet before us. A single construction standard, a unified transportation network. The road to Key West is simply a surviving fragment of this global web that natural catastrophes didn't manage to completely destroy. We call it Flagler's Railroad, but we might as well call the Egyptian pyramids Napoleon's warehouses just because he visited them. Appropriation, that's the key word of our era. Consider metal processing technology. Rails. In salt-saturated sea fog, early 20th century steel should have turned to rusty powder within 3 to 4 years. Corrosion in this region eats car bodies full of holes in 5 years. Yet we're shown photos where rails lie for years and trains run on them. Either Flagler possessed the secret of stainless steel, surpassing modern alloys, or rails were expendable material constantly replaced while hiding monstrous losses just to maintain the illusion of a functioning facility. Or, most frighteningly, the metal structures we see in old photos weren't made from steel as we know it. Perhaps these were remnants of alloys from that previous civilization that we learned to melt down but not recreate. The scariest part isn't even this. The scariest part is the silence. Why don't oceanographers study these bridges' foundations? Why are there no detailed reports on concrete composition at depth? Why do any attempts to take material samples from the pillar's lower portions meet bureaucratic resistance? The zone around many pillars has restricted status limiting diving and research. What's down there? Maybe you can see that the pillars don't descend into sand, but are tops of enormous buildings or technical structures. Maybe the pillars are towers of a submerged city that we adapted into a bridge. We stand at the threshold of a frightening but inevitable conclusion. The Flagler Railroad story isn't just a tale of corruption or engineering failure. It's a systemic glitch in the matrix of official history through which blinding truth leaks. If we acknowledge that people in the early 20th century didn't possess technology for such construction in open ocean, we must acknowledge the existence of a highly advanced civilization that was here before us. A civilization whose capabilities in manipulating matter, gravity, and energy exceeded our wildest fantasies. We live in a post-apocalyptic world. The global catastrophe that alternative researchers call the Great Flood or the Reset happened very recently, possibly in the mid-19th century. It swept billions of people from the face of the earth, changed continental outlines, and raised ocean levels, turning mountain ridges into island chains like the Florida Keys. Henry Flagler and his contemporaries weren't genius builders, but first colonists on the ruins of a dead world. They came to empty cities, dug out buildings buried in clay and sand, restored what they could understand, and claimed authorship. The railroad across the sea was a desperate attempt by the new masters of life to utilize gigantic infrastructure remnants from the past. But they didn't understand their true purpose. These arch structures probably weren't transportation arteries in our understanding. The arch shapes, their placement in water, the use of specific materials, all this suggests harvesting energy from the atmosphere or ionosphere. Wireless electricity transmission technologies that Nikola Tesla spoke about. Tesla didn't invent anything new. He simply remembered or found blueprints from that era. Flagler tried to run a primitive coal-burning steam engine on a supremely complex technical device. It's like using a microscope to hammer nails. Naturally, the system didn't work as planned, and nature, or the object's residual energy, rejected this intrusion with the 1935 hurricane. We've degraded. We look at these structures with iPhones in our hands, but cannot replicate the masonry supposedly done by illiterate workers in rags. This creates profound discomfort. The feeling that we've been deceived not in details, but in the most fundamental thing, understanding who we are. We're not the pinnacle of evolution. We're shipwreck survivors who found remains of a great liner on shore and are trying to build a hut from them. Official history carefully masks this fact, inventing lone heroes like Flagler to explain the presence of cyclopean ruins. They need us to believe in linear progress from stick and stone to iPhone. Admitting that 100 or 200 years ago construction technologies exceeded modern ones means admitting a global degradation or catastrophe that threw us back to the Stone Age, from which we only began emerging in the 19th century. Remember photos of the railroad's opening. Crowds in hats, flags, music. It looks like a cargo cult. Savages who found a working airplane, painted it with their patterns, and worship it without understanding aerodynamics principles. A train crawling across those majestic arches in the middle of the ocean looks alien. It's too small, too primitive for such a foundation. Like running a toy car on a Formula One track. The scale mismatch screams at us, "This isn't yours, you just occupied this place." And authorities understood this. That's exactly why, as soon as the mask was torn off by the 35 hurricane, they rushed to pave everything over. A concrete highway depersonalizes, it hides details. It turns a unique, ancient artifact into a utilitarian tourist road. The perfect crime. If this content shattered everything you thought you knew about American history, smash that like button and subscribe immediately. Every click is another brick in the wall of truth that will eventually demolish the fortress of official lies. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into forbidden history. Share this video with with everyone ready to see the world as it truly is, not as textbooks paint it. We are the army of the awakened, and our numbers are growing. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you can possibly imagine, and we've only scratched the surface.